2 summers when I was in college, I worked for Dollar Rent-A-Car. But I didn't work in what most people understand to be Dollar Rent-A-Car. I worked in a office building, kind of like this, in a little cubicle. I had a headset on the whole time, and I just took a constant barrage of phone calls from across the nation. And this was at a time where I'm old enough that they had computers, but they weren't great. They were called dummy terminals. And so there was no hard drive, there was no colors on the screen, there was no mouse. It was all commands that you typed into a keyboard that you had to have memorized. So before I could start, for 2 weeks, I went to Dollar Rent-A-Car University. There's a little school. And I had to memorize every airport code in North America, which is a 3-digit code. And some of them make sense, right? OKC, simple. Tulsa, TUL. Some of them make 0 sense at all, like Kansas City, MCO. What? No, that doesn't make any sense. Wait, is it MCO or is that Orlando? That's Orlando. What is it? MCO is Kansas City? What's Orlando? I forget, see? ORD, that's right. It is ORD. Yeah. Chicago, that one makes a little bit of sense, but there's 2 there. And then some of the smaller regional airports that we had places at, they got even weirder. And so I had to remember all of these and be able to type them in as they said it to me on the phone. And so back then the internet was really new. It existed in like 97 when I was doing this, but nobody was going to the internet to book you were like a space cadet if you did that. Like if you said I booked my own reservation, they would be like, wow, you are a genius. And so everybody called the number. And so, all day long I'm taking these phone calls. For 2 summers, I worked 40 to 50 hours a week for Dollar Rent-A-Car back when their national call center was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Then, a few years later, they outsourced it, and it's not even in America anymore. Thrifty car rental was in the basement, so, they would come up for lunch, and we'd hang out and share war stories. But I loved it. It was good pay. Especially for a guy that had been a security guard, right? That was my original training. I was going to be a security guard overnight at a factory in Tulsa. And so this was like double the pay. They had a free soda machine. You could drink as much soda as you wanted. They wanted your voice to be good. So I had one of those huge, big mugs that I would just fill up all day. How did I get diabetes? Anyway, let's not talk about that. Let's go back. But yeah, it was great. It was a great thing. But here's the one thing that was so interesting to me is that you could not rent a car at Dollar Rent-A-Car without going through me or one of my compadres. And there were about, at the high peak of the season in the summer, in our floor, there were about 100 of us. At night it dropped to 20 because calls weren't as busy. But it was a constant hold. It was busy. You had to go through us, these Okies in Tulsa, to get a car rented. You had to go through us. We were definitely the middleman. And, now 99% of them are done online. You don't need to talk to someone on the phone. There's probably 4 people that work on this now because back then we were this middleman. I remember one day a lady called into our line and she was calling in and I said, in which city will you need a car? That's my first line. Well, thank you for calling Dollar. In which city will you need a car? And then I would start typing, right? And she said, well, Miami. And so I started typing in Miami, MIA, and I'm going through it. And she's like, hold on. I don't need a car. I want to talk to my boyfriend. And I was like, well, I'm not him. I don't know what you want me to do about that. She's like, well, I called the Dollar hotline. He works at the Miami Airport Dollar rental counter. And I said, well, that's not this number. I'm in Tulsa. And she's like, well, the number, I keep calling the local number, and it keeps forwarding me to you, I guess, because I've talked to 6 of your friends there, and I can't get through to my boyfriend. I wish I could just call him directly. And I thought it was so wild that she'd been going through all this kind of red tape trying to talk to her boyfriend, and she kept calling the local number in her own area code and everything. It says on every printed piece of paper, this is the local number, but it would automatically forward her to me in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I just thought that was so interesting that she could never get through because I was the guy in the way. In the Old Testament, it's interesting. For the Hebrew Bible, we call it the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament kind of interchangeably, people did not really have, in the way that we do now, direct access to God. They always had to go through a mediator or a middleman, if you will. okay? So they didn't have that kind of direct one-on-one access. They weren't in the same way that you are free to speak to God right now if you'd like. They didn't have that direct access to God, and so they couldn't approach him. And the system that was set up in the Hebrew Bible is a priesthood. And we have little reference point for this. Like, we don't really get a grip on that because we are so far removed from that kind of language. But the priesthood was that kind of intermediary person. The priest would talk to God on your behalf, would make sacrifice on your behalf. And the high priest, who is kind of over all the priests, was kind of the most important person, would do the annual or the celebratory events. He would do the big sacrifices for nations and for groups of people. But what we will look at today is that Jesus is not just another priest in that system. Jesus is a priest who kind of, I think what we're going to really get to is he kind of began all the idea of that system and also kind of ended the need for that priest system in together. Now, this is going to be a little bit challenging for me over the next few minutes to get across because this is a topic we don't have a lot of data on, and so you have to kind of dig a little bit. So we're going to dig a little bit. But what I don't want you to do is completely think I'm a total wacko, all right? I want you to give me a little bit of runway so that I can connect some of the dots, because it does take connecting, because it's over thousands of years. We've got 3 verses, in Genesis, and then we've got maybe 4 verses in the Psalms, and then we've got several in Hebrews. And that's kind of all we know about this guy today we're going to talk about, Melchizedek. And so give me a little runway here, because there's some good evidence spread across these thousands of years as we piece this together. All right, so we got this guy, Melchizedek. And in Genesis, all we have pretty much are 3 verses. And it says this about this guy: Melchizedek, the king of Salem and priest of God Most High, brought Abram some bread and wine. Melchizedek blessed Abram with this blessing. And we're going to get to the blessing in just a second. But first we pause here, because the first things that jump out to us, think about how early this is. This is in the Genesis account, okay? Pretty close, in history, a lot closer than the Psalms or anything in the New Testament to the creation account. And what we see here first is a really interesting character who is a king and a priest, almost unheard of, right? And the scholars have said what we need to take note of here is that these 2 offices were going to be distinguishing characteristics throughout all of prophecy of the coming Messiah, that he would be a king and a priest, okay? And that is the first thing that should jump out off the page to us here about this Melchizedek. He's something different. He's not just in the line. Also, if he is blessing Abram, then who would become Abraham later, then this is a very early person, right? This is before the line of most priests that we read about in the Old Testament. And so that's the first thing that's kind of interesting. The second thing that's interesting is look at what he brings. He brings Abram some bread and wine. Now, the reason that jumps off the page to me is these are the exact symbols that Jesus would later use to represent his body and his blood in that Passover supper, the Last Supper with his disciples. He would use those. And even to this day, over 2,000 years later, this is what the global church continues to use as the elements to remember Jesus' death. That's the first thing. Now, if we continue on in this same text, this is the blessing. He says, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you." And then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. Now there's the end of what we know about Melchizedek. One thing I didn't mention that I think is interesting here, there's no genealogy. If you've been doing the Dwell app with us and we're reading systematically through the Bible over the year, sometimes, I don't know about you, but I get bogged down in the genealogy and I'm like, oh, come on. And so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so. And it's really intense, but that's on purpose, right? To show us the connections between people. We have no genealogy from Melchizedek. It's like he just came out of nowhere. Hold on to that. Put a pin in that, all right? We're going to go back. So the language here is interesting. God the Most High, creator of heaven and earth. The reason that's interesting is this is very similar to language that Jesus would use much later in Matthew chapter 11 and Luke chapter 10. He calls God the Lord of heaven and earth. So again, we see a kind of connection here between the language. It's a specific kind of language. He uses that twice, once in Matthew's account and once in Luke's account. So we have this interesting character, Melchizedek. And throughout history, there's been a lot of speculation about Melchizedek. There's been a lot of talk. The reason, because we don't have a lot of other strong details. We don't have a full genealogy. We don't know where he comes from. We don't really understand his authority of king and priest together. And so this high priest, Melchizedek, appears only once in Genesis 14 and then is referenced later, but this is the main time that we learn about him. So in Psalms and Hebrews, we'll look at those texts of what it says about him, but it's pretty brief too. And so we have this priest and king. And some scholars, and quite a few now, believe that Melchizedek is kind of a appearance of Jesus, if you will. A pre-appearance of Jesus in some way. And that's pretty probable because if we go a little bit later in Genesis 17 and 18, we see that Abraham spoke with the Lord in the form of a man. And we see evidence in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20, Jesus has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And an order for priests means succession. And so scholars have pointed out, how could you be a priest and a king and be in a succession and there's no other one listed between Melchizedek and Jesus? Would that make much sense? It makes a lot of sense that this Melchizedek is some sort of appearance of Christ before Christ. And it doesn't completely throw us off because we know that the Bible tells us that God was in creation in the form of Christ as well, the Word, right? The capital W-R-D. So it's not Jesus incarnate, right? Not Jesus in the flesh, but it was Jesus present even from the very beginning. And so the order is something that is then vested eternally in Jesus and in him alone. That would mean that Melchizedek is some sort of appearance of Christ, prefiguring the Lord's ministry before that. Now, the reason I say that is because who we studied last week, David, in the Psalms, David writes, and he writes about this Melchizedek, which I think is really interesting. And this is what he said. He said, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." So you go all the way from Genesis until Psalm 110 before you hear about Melchizedek again. That's wild, right? To me, that's a little bit interesting that we have this very long period of time. And what's also interesting here is, first of all, I highlighted the words right hand because in Hebrews it says that Christ sits at the Father's right hand. And yet, here we're talking about this priest in the order of Melchizedek. Who would that be? Well, Jesus, once again, is a strong indicator because John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, capital W-O-R-D, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. That's the Word. The Word becomes flesh and dwells amongst us is Jesus. That's where he is born through the Virgin Mary. That's the Word becoming flesh. But the Word existed before that. It's not as if that is the first time that Jesus has existed. And the strongest evidence, I think, if we fast forward many years past Psalms and we get to Hebrews, this is where I think we find the real most clear definitions for us. And so I want to read to you just a brief section there in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, because this is where I think it really comes out. Now, if we just go back a little bit to verse 5 it says, that is why Christ did not honor himself by assuming he could become high priest, capitalized. No, he was chosen by God, who said to him, you are my son, today I've become your father. And verse 6, in another passage, God said to him, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So once again, we see that language coming forth. While Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears to the one who could rescue him from death. And God heard his prayers because of his deep reverence for God. And even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. In this way, God qualified him as a perfect high priest, and he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. And here's the clinch moment, verse 10. And God designated him to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. That kind of is the summation of what this is headed towards. Jesus is not just another priest. Jesus is not just another mediator between us and God. He is the high priest. And Melchizedek is a whole different order of priests, not like the priests that we read about in the Old Testament. He is outside of that. He is king and priest. He is in a different way. So he appears once in Genesis, he appears in the Psalms, and he's a mysterious figure who's a king and a priest. So a lot of people kind of come to the idea then that this Melchizedek speaking to Abram, this Melchizedek blessing him, bringing him the bread and the wine, this is an early appearance of Christ before he becomes Jesus Christ, before he fully is represented to us, which would align with kind of other visions that we've seen of like how God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, the wind, God is heard in the wind before he becomes. So it kind of fits in line with that because it's very interesting. And the thing that helps us kind of connect all these dots is what this does for us is helps us see that Jesus is way outside of just another mediator. He's not just another like person between us and God. He's this perfect fuse, this perfect connection as high priest and king, as the Messiah. And so what that means for us is that we don't rely on an imperfect mediator anymore. We see most clearly God through the person of Jesus. This would be a Melchizedek existed before the law existed. This would be someone whose priesthood didn't come from a tradition, but a priest that was directly from God. N.T. Wright says it this way about this idea. He says, the work of the high priest was to represent the people before God and God before the people. In Jesus, these two roles are perfectly and finally fused. He is the one in whom the living water of God's own life is available for the world. And he is the one who, as the representative human being, offers to God the worship which is God's due. So it's bringing all this together. It's like summarizing and bringing it all together. I think it's not dissimilar from how when they're trying to press Jesus on what is the greatest commandment, and the scribes are after Jesus, they're trying to trap him, these lawyers are trying to trap Jesus, and Jesus says, it's two. It's love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And if you get those two things, all the law and the prophets hang on that. That's similar to this. It's like in Jesus, we have this perfect high priest, and in Jesus, we have this king, and it's all brought together in one thing, so it's not imperfect. It's not difficult to find God anymore because we have this perfect representation, this fusion of what we need in a mediator, but also the living water. A perfect representative human being who can offer to God the worship he needs, but also God's own availability to us. I was reading about these India root bridges, and I spent some time in India with some of our missions partners, and I never saw one of these, but apparently these are grown there specifically because there's a certain kind of rubber tree, and they work hard to make them kind of grow together across water like this. And I was reading that as the roots grow and as they connect to each other further and deeper, it makes a strong enough bridge to carry many thousands of pounds over. People can walk on them. People can roll things over them. But they take about 25 years to grow together to be strong enough for that. And so what you see is generation after generation building these things together. And about 50 people at a time can be on one once it's fully developed. And then, according to their histories, these will last for about 500 years. So it takes about 25 years to develop, and then it will last them about 500 years. And I was reading one of the leaders of one of the villages was saying, what these bridges are to us is life. They are a living link to some of our villages that would be lifeless without these links. And to me, once again, I thought of this when I had seen this picture and read the story about these living bridges of just how Jesus is that bridge for us to God. We are fully separated from God, like not even in the same ballpark, have no right to speak to him, have no vision of how we could ever connect with him. And Jesus comes in and creates that high priest, creates that all human, all God link back to God, to where we have an opportunity to be at peace with God. Augustine wrote it this way. He said, God became man so that following a man, something you are able to do, you might reach God, which is formerly impossible for you. Because I think there is a lot of question, logical and otherwise. Why did God need to become man? Why did Jesus need to become incarnate in the flesh? Why did the Word need to do that? What was the purpose of that? And I think St. Augustine said it really well here. It's like, we know how to follow a person. We find it difficult to follow God. And so Jesus came to teach us how to follow God, to be that perfect and final mediator, to be that perfect and final living link back to God, so that we would have that opportunity. In John 1, it says it like this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. In Jesus, in a very real way, heaven and earth meet. That's why his life was so powerful here. That's why the miracles existed. That's why his death was so powerful here. That's why the resurrection is so powerful here, is because you have two different realities coming together, two different realms coming together. You have heaven and earth in the person of Jesus. And what it does for us is gives us access to something that we've never had access to before. And so in Jesus, heaven and earth meet. And as this happens, if we go back to the beginning, if we roll this all the way back, what you see throughout the Old Testament is systems in place. Systems of priests, someone who can represent you to God. If you study the tabernacle, and we'll do that in a couple weeks, we talk about the tabernacle idea. People could not the tabernacle was much different than a church. Like, people could not come in to be the presence of God. They were not allowed to. Only the high priest could kind of go into the Holy of Holies and kind of speak to God, right? Represent the people. And so you had that system. And then Jesus comes, and he's much different because he's the one that finally closes that gap. There was still, even with the high priest and God, there's still this huge gap. Jesus closes that gap for us. And in that moment, humanity and God are no longer far away. And so the invitation is quite simple for us then. It's to trust the only bridge safe enough to get us to God. The only mediator that has the power to do that is to put our faith and our hope in him, to trust Jesus fully. So I want to invite you today to not follow another person or a system or a priest. You don't have to put anyone on a pedestal. Instead, to follow Jesus, to follow the one who lived his life perfect, who died on the cross for you, and who invites you in, no matter who you are or what you've done, invites you in and says, the resurrection matters for you. No one comes to the Father, Jesus says, except through me. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And that's the invitation for you.